The heartbreaking case of Jessica Evans and Jacob Wheeler. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Jessica Evans sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the flickering light above casting eerie shadows on the cracked tiles. Her hands trembled as she held the phone, its cold plastic pressing against her palm. Jacob hadn't called. Not once. She stared at the clock. 1:17 a.m. The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling the windows like desperate fingers trying to claw their way inside. Something felt wrong. She reached for her coat, her breath shallow, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. The drive to Jacob's house was a blur. Her fingers clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, the dark road stretching endlessly ahead. The street lights flickered, bathing the pavement in an unsettling glow. Her car rolled to a stop in front of his house. The door was ajar. A sliver of darkness waited beyond. Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears as she stepped out, her shoes crunching against the gravel. Jacob, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The air inside was thick, stale. Something metallic tinged the air, a scent she recognized but didn't want to name. Her foot brushed against something soft. A jacket. Jacob's. A shiver crawled up her spine. She took another step, then another. A shape loomed in the dim light, slumped against the couch. Her breath hitched. Jacob. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide, frozen in terror. A single red line traced his throat, dark against his pale skin. Jessica's scream never left her lips. A creak sounded behind her. Slow, deliberate. A breath warm, too close. Then, darkness. Jessica's world collapsed into blackness. Cold, heavy, silent. Her body refused to move, but her mind screamed. She wasn't alone. A sharp scent, damp wood, sweat, something sour, filled her nostrils. Her head throbbed. When she opened her eyes, the room was unfamiliar. Dim light filtered through wooden slats, casting jagged patterns on the concrete floor. Ropes burned against her wrists. She was tied. A chair. Her breathing came fast, shallow, each inhale stinging her throat. Then, footsteps. Measured. Calm. Someone was watching. A shadow shifted in the corner. Jessica's stomach twisted. She forced herself to look up. A figure stepped into the light. Tall. Dark clothes. A mask smooth, featureless. The voice that followed was soft. Too soft. You shouldn't have come. Jessica's chest heaved. Who are you? Her voice cracked, barely audible. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. A gloved hand reached forward, tracing the air between them. Not touching, just close enough to make her skin crawl. This was never your story, the voice murmured. Jessica's pulse roared in her ears. Jacob. Dead. And now. Her. Her body tensed. She had to run. Had to fight. Had to. A sharp sound cut through the silence. The snap of a blade being unsheathed. The figure leaned in. Jessica's scream tore through the darkness. Then, nothing. The silence after her scream was deafening. Her chest heaved. Her body trembled, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, the blade gleaming in the dim light, its tip catching the shallow rise and fall of her breath. Jessica's eyes darted around the room. No windows. One door. Her wrists burned as she struggled against the ropes, the fibers digging into her skin. The figure exhaled slowly, as if savoring the moment. Then, it spoke. Do you want to know the truth? Jessica's breath hitched. She didn't answer. Didn't dare. The figure took a step closer. Then another. Jacob wasn't who you thought he was. Jessica's mind reeled. What was this? Some sick game? You're lying. The words barely left her lips before the blade flicked upward. A blur of steel. Jessica flinched, but the blade didn't touch her. Instead, the figure turned it slowly, deliberately toward itself. Then, with an unsettling calm, it lifted the mask. Jessica's stomach dropped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her world tilted. No, it couldn't be. Jacob. Alive. But his eyes. Cold. Void. Not the Jacob she knew. Not anymore. Now, he whispered, Do you understand? Jessica's body went rigid. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run. But she was frozen, because in that moment she knew the real Jacob Wheeler had died long before tonight. And whatever stood before her now was something else entirely. Jessica's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes saw. Jacob dead. Yet Jacob, standing before her. His face was the same, but his eyes, empty, wrong. Something inhuman lurked behind them, something watching, waiting. Her pulse pounded as she forced out a whisper. "You're not Jacob." A slow smile curled his lips. "Not warm, not familiar. You're finally starting to see." His voice was deeper now, hollow, as if layered with something else, something crawling beneath his skin. Jessica yanked at the ropes again. Harder. Flesh tore. Pain flared up her arms. But she didn't stop. Didn't care. She had to get out. Jacob, or whatever he was, tilted his head. "You should have left it alone, Jess." His voice dripped with something off, like an echo of a person who no longer existed. She swallowed hard. "This isn't real," she whispered. Jacob crouched in front of her, eyes locked onto hers. His face was close now, too close. She could smell him. Not sweat, not blood, something older, something rotten. His lips barely moved as he spoke. "Reality is just a matter of perception." Her body went rigid. He lifted the blade, not toward her, toward himself. Jessica's breath caught as the knife pressed into his own skin. Not cutting, just pressing. Enough for the surface to shift, stretch, twist. His face moved, like something underneath was struggling to break free. Jessica's stomach lurched. Her pulse screamed. This wasn't Jacob. This was never Jacob. The thing wearing his face leaned in. And then, the lights flickered. The ropes around her wrists suddenly slackened. Her body tensed an opportunity. She didn't hesitate. Didn't think. Jessica lunged. Pain shot through her limbs as she hit the floor. She scrambled to her feet, blood dripping from her wrists. Jacob, or the thing pretending to be him, just stood there, watching, unmoving. "You can run," he murmured. His smile widened. Too far, lips stretching in a way no human should. Jessica didn't stay to see what happened next. She bolted for the door. Her feet pounded against the floor, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. The darkness behind her shifted. The air grew thick. She could feel it. Something coming. Something not human. She threw herself against the door. It burst open. Cold night air hit her like a slap. She ran. Branches tore at her skin as she stumbled through the trees. She didn't look back. Couldn't. Because she knew. If she did, she might see something she couldn't escape. Something that no longer needed to pretend to be Jacob Wheeler. And if she saw it, it would be too late. Jessica ran. Faster than she ever had in her life. The forest closed in around her, branches clawing at her skin like desperate hands. Her breath burned. Her legs ached. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. Not running. Not chasing. Just following. Steady. Patient. Too close. Too calm. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The trees blurred in the darkness. Nothing there, but she could feel it. Watching. Waiting. Jessica swallowed her scream and pushed forward. The trees thinned. A road. Relief surged through her. She stumbled onto the pavement, lungs on fire. Headlights. A car. She threw herself into the street, arms flailing. Brakes screeched. The vehicle skidded to a halt inches from her. A man jumped out, middle-aged, concerned. "Jesus, are you okay?" Jessica's lips parted, words failing her. Behind her, the woods were silent. Nothing moved. The man's eyes flickered past her, scanning the trees. Her pulse pounded. Couldn't he feel it? Didn't he see? She turned. Darkness. Stillness. The thing that had been following her was gone. Or hiding. Waiting. Her voice finally broke free. "Please," she gasped. "Take me. Get me away from here." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Get in." She yanked open the car door, throwing herself inside. The lock clicked. Safe. Maybe. The car rumbled back to life, tires rolling over the pavement. Jessica sagged against the seat, her hands still shaking. The man glanced at her, concern deepening in his eyes. "What happened to you?" She opened her mouth, paused. How could she explain? Would he even believe her? She turned her head, staring out the window. The road stretched into the night, empty, endless. Then, her stomach turned to ice. In the reflection of the glass, a face. Not hers, not the man's. Smiling, stretching, watching. The same face she had run from. The same thing wearing Jacob's skin. Inside the car. With her. Jessica's breath hitched. Her fingers dug into the seat. She wanted to scream, but it was already too late. Jessica's body went cold. Her breath froze in her throat. The reflection in the window stared back at her. That smile. Too wide. Too wrong. Slowly, so slowly, she turned her head. The back seat was empty. Nothing there. But the reflection, still smiling, still watching. Her hands clenched into fists. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering to herself. Not real. Not real. Not real. Asterisk, asterisk. The driver glanced at her. Are you okay? Jessica forced herself to look at him. His face was normal, human, concerned, but something inside her whispered, check the mirror. She hesitated. Then, heart hammering, she shifted her gaze to the rearview mirror. Her stomach lurched. It was there, in the back seat, grinning. Not a reflection, not an illusion. Real, and closer. Jessica's breath hitched. The driver frowned. What's wrong? She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure in the mirror leaned forward, closer, closer. A cold breath ghosted against her neck. A voice, barely a whisper. You can't leave me behind, Jessica. Her scream shattered the night. The driver swerved. The car spun. Tires screeched. Jessica felt the world tilt, the violent jolt of impact. Then, darkness. Silence. Nothing. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. A rhythmic beeping pulled her back. Slow. Steady. Jessica's eyelids fluttered open. Bright lights. White walls. The sharp scent of antiseptic. She was in a hospital. Alive. Barely. Her body ached, wrapped in bandages. Memories rushed back in jagged pieces. The car. The crash. The thing in the back seat. Her pulse spiked. A nurse appeared, adjusting her fore. You're lucky, the woman said gently. The driver didn't make it, but you survived. Jessica swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry. Her voice cracked. Was there someone else in the car? The nurse frowned. No, just you. Jessica's skin crawled. No, that wasn't right. She knew what she saw. She knew. Her eyes flickered to the mirror across the room, and her heart stopped. There, standing in the reflection, behind her hospital bed, was Jacob, smiling, waiting. Her breath hitched. Her fingers clenched the sheets. The nurse glanced at her monitor. Your heart rate just spiked. Are you in pain? Jessica's lips trembled. She tore her gaze from the mirror, forcing herself to breathe. Slow, steady. When she looked back, the reflection was gone. But she knew. It wasn't over. Not yet. Not ever. The hospital felt too quiet. Too still. Jessica's skin prickled as she stared at the mirror. The reflection was gone. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. Watching. Waiting. A deep unease settled in her bones. She had to leave. Now. Her fingers fumbled for the fore, ripping it from her arm. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but she didn't care. Didn't stop. She swung her legs over the bed, her body weak, trembling. The nurse frowned. Miss Evans, you need to rest. Jessica shook her head. I have to go. Her voice barely sounded like her own. The nurse stepped closer, concern in her eyes. Jessica's breath hitched. Something was wrong. The nurse's face. Too smooth. Too pale. Her eyes. Empty. Jessica's pulse spiked. She stumbled backward. The nurse's lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. And then, she spoke. Not in her voice. In his. Jacob's. You can't run forever, Jess. Jessica's scream choked in her throat. She turned and bolted. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor as she burst into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, eerie shadows. The hallway stretched. Too long. Too endless. She ran. Doors blurred past her. Each one she passed. A whisper. A murmur. Her name, slithering through the air. Jessica. 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 Her breath came in ragged gasps. She reached the end of the corridor. A door. Exit. Her fingers curled around the handle, yanking it open. Cold night air hit her skin. Relief flooded her. She staggered outside, her legs weak, shaking. The parking lot was empty. Silent. Too silent. Her gaze darted around. Nothing. No one. She took a shaky step forward. Then, the streetlight above her flickered. Her shadow stretched unnaturally long. Twisted. Wrong. A shiver crawled up her spine. She knew what was coming. Knew what was already here. Slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. She turned around. Jacob stood beneath the flickering light. Or rather, the thing that wore his face. Still smiling. Still waiting. Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps. Her body screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, then another. It didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared. Then, it spoke. Soft, certain, final. You're exactly where you were meant to be. Darkness crashed over her. And this time, there was no escape. Jessica's world collapsed into nothingness. Cold, endless, weightless. She drifted in the dark, suspended, her thoughts sluggish, slipping through her grasp like sand. Was she dead? No, not yet. A whisper curled around her. Soft, mocking. You fought so hard, Jessica. Jacob's voice. But not Jacob. Never Jacob. Her body jerked, suddenly aware. The darkness thinned, warping, shifting. Shapes emerged. A floor. A ceiling. A dim, pulsing light overhead. She was lying down, strapped to something cold. Metal restraints dug into her wrists and ankles. A surgical table. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to move. Nothing. Panic flared in her chest, hot and choking. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The air smelled stale, tinged with something chemical. Jessica swallowed hard, her pulse racing. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the room. Footsteps. Approaching. Then, a shadow leaned over her. Jacob's face. Wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, like a mask stretched over something else. The eyes. Not human. Empty black voids that swallowed the light. Jessica's throat tightened. He smiled. You're ready now. Her breath hitched. Ready? For what? Asterisk, asterisk. She fought against the restraints, her skin burning. Jacob. No, the thing that had taken him, tilted its head. You still don't understand, do you? His fingers trailed along her arm, a touch too cold, too lifeless. You've been part of this since the beginning. Jessica's body seized with terror. No, she whispered. The thing's grin widened. It reached into its pocket, pulled something out, a small, silver mirror, held it above her face. Jessica's stomach dropped. Her own reflection stared back. But it wasn't her. Not anymore. Her eyes. Black. Empty. Just like his. A scream built in her throat. But she never got the chance to let it out. Because the moment she realized the truth, she was already gone. The world around Jessica dissolved into a blur of cold shadows and distorted sounds. Her scream was trapped in her chest, muffled by the weight of something terrible pressing down on her. The air felt thick, suffocating, and yet somehow, she couldn't move. She was still there, still in the room, still on the cold table, but everything had shifted. Her mind raced, trying to grasp at anything familiar, anything real. But nothing made sense anymore. The reflection, her eyes black, hollow, a distant whisper echoed through her mind. You were always part of the plan. The words were no longer Jacob's. They were something else. A deep, inhuman voice that vibrated in her bones. She wanted to shut it out, to scream, to fight, but the restraints held her still. A new presence entered the room. A figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, stood at the foot of the table. It moved with a fluidity that was both unnerving and unnatural. The figure leaned forward, its form shifting in and out of focus, as if it didn't belong to this reality. Jessica's breath quickened as the figure stepped closer. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. The voice returned, softer now, closer to her ear. The transformation is complete. Jessica's heart thudded in her chest. Her vision blurred again, and when it cleared, she was standing, not on the table, not restrained, but standing in front of the figure, her body moving as if she had no control. Her arms were outstretched. Her hands clawed sharp, unnatural. Her legs felt like they were no longer her own. The figure whispered, "Now you are one of us." A cold, crushing weight pressed down on her chest. Something shifted inside her, like a part of her soul being torn away and replaced with something darker. The room swam, twisting as if it had no true form. The walls folded in on themselves. The figure was gone, and in its place, a mirror. A long, cracked mirror. Jessica was no longer reflected in it. Instead, a new version of herself stared back. Her eyes were empty, her skin pale, her expression vacant, devoid of anything human. And as she reached out to touch the mirror, it shattered. The pieces rained down around her, and she felt her body, no, this thing that used to be her tremble with a new kind of hunger. The transformation was complete, and there was no going back. Jessica, stood frozen amidst the shards of glass. The remnants of her human self were gone, replaced by something hollow, something that felt both ancient and newly born. The hunger inside her stirred, sharp and insistent. The coldness in her veins grew, pulling her toward the broken glass scattered across the floor. She crouched down, reaching out to touch one of the shards. Her fingers brushed the sharp edges, but there was no pain. The glass shifted under her touch, twisting, forming into a shape, an image of what she used to be. Her reflection stared back, not in terror, but in acceptance. The creature that had once been Jessica felt the pull of the reflection, her body moving without her consent, as if drawn to it by some invisible force. The mirror image smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was the smile of the thing she had become. The transformation was not a one-time event. It was an awakening, a return. Her fingers clenched into fists, shards cutting into her hands, but she felt nothing. No pain, just hunger. Deep, gnawing hunger. From the corner of the room, a door creaked open. A figure entered. Not Jacob. Not even a human. It was like them, the creatures that had been waiting, just beyond her comprehension. Its eyes, black, empty, just like hers, locked onto her. It spoke in the same cold, hollow voice. Come. The word was not a command, but an invitation. An offering. Jessica, felt the pull. Her body obeyed, standing as if the very air around her held power. The door before her loomed, opening to an abyss of shadows, of endless voids. She stepped forward, each movement silent, precise, like a marionette with its strings pulled taut. And as she passed the threshold of the door, she felt herself slipping, away from the last remnants of her human soul. The hunger intensified, spreading from her chest to her limbs, until it consumed her entirely. The world beyond the door was dark, but alive. Alive in a way that made her feel whole again. No more fear, no more confusion, just the hunger. And the creatures, her new family. They stood in the dark, waiting for her to join them. Her new existence. It had only just begun, and this time, there would be no escape. As Jessica, stepped deeper into the shadows, the door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the world she had once known. The air was thick here, suffocating, but she welcomed it. It was right. Her senses felt sharper, more attuned to the darkness, to the whispers that flickered at the edges of her mind. She could hear them now. The creatures. Their low, guttural voices murmured in a language older than the earth itself, vibrating through her bones. They were beckoning her, pulling her further into the depths. Her skin tingled with an electric chill, but it was no longer unpleasant. It was comfortable, familiar. The walls around her began to shift, twisting, as if the very structure of the place had no set form. Nothing was solid here. Not the ground beneath her feet, not the air she breathed, not even the creatures themselves. They were just shapes, shadows, not human, not even alive in the way she once understood life. She moved through the ever-changing space, her body feeling weightless, as if she was no longer tethered to the physical world. But her mind, her thoughts, they were sharper than ever. She could feel it now, the thing that had been waiting, the true hunger, not just for food, not for any kind of sustenance she once understood, but for souls, for memories, for existence itself. Her reflection, her former self, flickered in the dark corners of her vision. A reminder of what she had lost, but also of what she had gained. Power. The hunger was now a part of her. It was an insatiable force, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. But now, it was her guide, her purpose, her calling. The creatures, her new family, moved closer, their forms coalescing into shapes, half seen in the dark. They circled her, their voices echoing, a low hum that filled the air. She is one of us. She has crossed the line. She will feed. Their words wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. And as she stood there, bathed in darkness, she understood. This was no longer about survival. This was about something far worse. She wasn't just the last of her kind. She was the beginning, the first of a new hunger. And in the deep, suffocating dark, she could feel it. Feel her power stretching out like tendrils, reaching into the void. The world above, the one she had once known, it was now distant, unreachable. And for the first time, Jessica, embraced the emptiness. It was no longer a prison. It was freedom. And as she disappeared further into the shadows, the creatures closed in, their hunger, just like hers, just as insatiable. And so, the world would never be the same again. There would be no escaping the darkness. That I in the darkness, Jessica, finally understood the truth. The hunger, the void, the creatures that had once been distant, strange shadows at the edges of her existence, were now her companions, her family. And together, they moved through the depths, unseen by any living soul, reaching into places where the light could never touch. In the world above, the one she had once known, the memories of Jessica Evans were fading, forgotten. The people who had once known her, who had called her friend, daughter, sister, none of them would ever remember her. It was as though she had never existed. Her name was lost in time, slipping through the cracks of reality, swallowed whole by the hunger that now consumed her. But in the dark, in the void, Jessica was something more. She was part of something eternal. Her mind, though no longer human, still clung to fragments of what she had been, the ghost of who she was. And sometimes in the quietest of moments, she felt a flicker, a memory of warmth, of light, of life. But those moments were fleeting, slipping away faster than they came. They were not meant for her anymore. Her new family, these shadowed beings that had once been strangers, taught her the ways of the hunger. They showed her that there was no end to the emptiness, no limit to how far she could reach, how far she could spread. It was only a matter of time before she would be a part of the darkness, forever, a part of the creatures, a part of the hunger. There would be no return. And as Jessica, moved deeper into the abyss, a final thought crossed her mind, so faint, so distant. What had it all been for? But even that question faded as she embraced her new existence. The hunger had won, and the darkness, once terrifying, was now home. She was no longer the girl who had fought to survive. She was the thing that moved in the dark, waiting for the next soul to consume. And so, the world above continued, unaware of the dark force beneath it, waiting to feed.